All right, hey guys. So if you either are watching this for the second time or you missed class, we're going to go over our shape versus form lecture and discussion that we had today. Make sure that you guys are pausing in between some of the questions that we're going to ask to give it some thought before hitting play again and listening to kind of what we figured out during class. Okay, so what we're going to use in our sketchbook, we're going to turn it to the side and we're going to take our notes in our sketchbook. So what I'm going to start by doing is just splitting our paper in half, right? So it's 12 inches long here, so I'm going to put a dot at 6. And then all I'm going to do is come along here and give myself a line all the way down. And then I'm going to take my ruler, line it up pretty straight so that I'm getting 2 columns. And I'm going to come down pretty much all the way. So at the top of one, I'm going to write in shape. And on the other one, I'm going to write in form. And so we're just going to set up a compare and contrast situation in our sketchbook so that we can start to break down what we know about the two. So I'm going to go in and just so that we can kind of start thinking about the space that we're going to need, I'm going to go ahead and give myself 3/4 of an inch for our first 2 questions. So 3/4 plus 3/4 gives me a half. All right, make sure to reference your ruler info sheet if you need a reminder on how to find those on here. And then after that, I'm going to give myself an 1.5 inches. Yeah, 1.5 inches for my other boxes. All right, so now that I got these broken up, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of eyeball it to try and give me that setup. And then we have made our own compare and contrast graphic organizer. This isn't just for art. You could use this kind of setup for any story that you're doing in any class, or if you're learning something in math or science, history. So it's always good to learn how to make some of these for ourselves. It helps us just organize our thoughts. All right, so now that I've got that set up, we're going to start with our first question, which is, what do we think the difference between shape and form is? So what is the difference? That's how I might shorten that for my notes, right? So go ahead and pause really quick. Take a few seconds to jot down some notes here about what you think the difference between form and shape is. All right, so now that you've done that, one thing that you might come to think about is like, okay, what are some shapes that I know? I know circles, squares, stars, stuff like that, right? Maybe we found that they're all flat, right? Easily nameable. I'm already familiar with them, right? Those are some good things that we can think about. And what I really want us to get from shape, right, is that it is 2-dimensional, right, or 2D. So 2-dimensional. So what does that mean about form, right? The form, we talk about that in our face all the time when we were doing our introductory portraits and stuff like that, right? Form is what gives our shape some depth, right? Some definition to it. So what we're thinking for form, the opposite of 2D, right, is going to be 3D. So here we've got 3-dimensional, right? So maybe we've got solid, I don't know, I'm just going to go with forms, right? Objects, things, right? They take up space. Maybe they're real, right? So that's what we can get for number 1. Maybe you came up with some other things, which is awesome. So now let's look at not just 2-dimension and 3-dimension and talk about what that looks like. Let's go back to our math and think about what exactly we're getting with our 2-dimension versus 3-dimension, right? So if we have a flat shape, think of like a square, right? If we're trying to find the area to a square, we might do length times width, right? So there's gonna be two dimensions, right? 1, 2, right? It's flat. If we go over to 3, we have to add in our third dimension. So go ahead and pause and think about what our third dimension might be. All right, so if you guess correctly, it's depth, right? It's something that goes back into space. So let's take a second and just write out what are some shapes that we know. Let's go ahead and jot them down really quick. All right, so the big 3 that I want to focus on for this demonstration are these symbols that we are probably fairly familiar with. All right, so take a second to write down what the names of these shapes are. Pause, and now that we're back, yeah, you guessed it, right? Our first one is a circle. Our second one is a square. And our third one is a triangle. Right? Now our square, right, we could change it up, make it a rectangle by making it, different sizes. Right? We could do longer, taller, right? All different things like that. Circles are pretty much circles. And then triangles, right, we have our different kinds. We can have a right triangle. We can have an isosceles triangle. Oh my gosh, I don't know if I remember what the third one is. Isosceles, right? I can't think of it. Well, I'm sure we can come back to that and you can look that up in your math classes, right? But we have all these different types of triangles based on the types of angles we see, right? This one's got an obtuse angle, which is big. This one's a right angle. And this one's got 3 equal ones, I believe. And then we've got some that have those acute triangles in them as well. All right, so all these can look different ways, right? Circles are pretty much different sizes. So let's think about question number 2. Right? What form names go with these shapes? So go ahead and take a moment to write those down. All right, so our circle, right, if we give that some space, we're going to call it a sphere. A square is going to become a cube, and a triangle might become a cone. All right, so for a sphere, we start out by drawing our shape, right? Same thing for our cube. We start out with that same shape, but then we have to do something to it. So let's take a minute to think. What do we need to think about when going from a shape to a form? What do we need to think about when going from shape to form? So go ahead and take a minute, pause the video, jot down some thoughts. All right, so one thing we might think about, right, is form has more shading to it, right? Maybe it has a shadow. Maybe it interacts with space, right? Like our 3D space. It's gonna have highlight, right? Maybe we need to think about a light source. These are all good things to think about. So then how do we draw that in here? All right. So when we think of a sphere, we need to think of the direction from a light source. So our light source is going to be up in this corner. So I'm going to draw a little symbol for a sun with an arrow. in each of these guys. Actually, I'm going to put it in separate corners so that we can learn different ways. All right. So for our sphere, if our light source is over here, that means we can go ahead and draw our shadow of our circle underneath it in the opposite direction, right? Because this would be blocking our shape. And then our highlight would probably be over here on this edge. So we can make another little circle over here. Now, what I like to start with is putting in my shadow. And even though I'm using pen, you guys can go ahead and use your wooden pencils, right? And we do that so that we make sure we can turn that pencil on its side and really get that good shading out of it. I'm using a pen in the video just because it shows it better on my camera. All right, so once we've got our nice dark shadow in, what we can now do is start to make some directional marks and shade so that it is darker at the bottom of our circle. And then it'll get lighter as it goes up to that highlight. And we can keep coming back in and adding more and more of that value to our shape as we come around the circle. Until we get something that's got some form to it, right? That now looks like it sits in space, right? Maybe throw a little line back here, make it look like it's sitting on the edge of a table, right? So we've got our highlight, we've got our different values that show us form, and then we've got our shadow. So that's how we do a sphere. So now let's look and see how we do a cube. The easiest way is to draw a square, and then let's take 3 lines going back at the same angle, the same distance, so they're all the same length, right? They all have the same depth. And then what you're going to do is parallel to this line here, you're going to come down and connect our top two. And then parallel to this line here, we're going to come over and draw our back. And now we've got a pretty realistic looking cube. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and say that my sun is coming this way and mostly going this way, right? So this one came down, this one's going mostly over. So I'm going to draw my shadow out from the side and out from the side, and then bring my shadow down to about out here, and then follow this line out here, and now I can go ahead and put in my shadow. So I'm going to make that nice and dark, get a nice long shadow on here. And now we have to think about how our light is going to show up on our cube, right? So if our light's hitting over here, that means this side over here is going to be our brightest and maybe our top is. So then is this one or this one going to be our next darkest? Go ahead and think about that for a minute. Our light's coming from here. So probably our darkest is going to be whatever is making this dark shadow, right? So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add maybe a 4 value to this side. Again, I'm only using pen so that it shows up nice for you guys in the tutorial. You guys can do this with your pencil. So now we need to make sure that we know that this side is different from this one and our top. So we're going to come in, maybe do another value of like a 2 or a 3. So come in and work that out. And there we go. So now we've got our highlight, our shadow, and then our other sides to give us form. And now let's think about our cone, right? When we take a cone, we're taking that triangle and we're spinning it around, right? So when we do that, this goes around to form a circle. So I like to come in with our top 2 shapes, and then this line here that would go across, we're going to turn into a circle. All right, but we're only going to draw the bottom half of it. And then I'm going to put my sun over here, coming this way. And then with that, I'm just going to draw in that same direction my few points. And maybe my shadow would look something like that. And I'm going to come in and color in my shadow. All right, so now I've got my shadow in there, and I'm going to do that same thing, except this time I'm going to make this side over here darker. And as it comes around, I'm going to follow down to the bottom so that our highlight is over on this edge. Maybe my shadow's right in the middle over here on the back of our cone. All right, and then I could come back in with some directional marks the other way to kind of show that circular shape on the bottom. All right, so we know we have to think about our light source, right? Where it's coming from to create our shadow. We have to do our shading to fill in those different values. And we have to think about how it interacts with the space, right? So our form is kind of our 3D extension of our shape. Shapes build into form. All right, and then thinking about how our light source interacts, right? These directional arrows that I did here can be really helpful when we're starting out with our still life, right? If we're doodling or drawing, thinking about where that light source comes from is gonna help everything kind of come together, create our shadows. So always make sure we're thinking about those light sources. All right, so now let's take a second to just think really quickly about the different forms we have on our face, right? So let's do number 4. What forms do we have in our face? So go ahead, pause the video, take a minute to think about this before clicking back on. All right, so one thing we might notice, right, is our head is kind of like, oops, if I could spell right, a sphere, right? It's a mix almost between a sphere and a cube, depending on our different jaw lines. Our eyes are definitely spheres, right? Maybe we think of, our ears. I think our ears are more like cubes, right? Maybe when we think about our cheeks, right? Those are kind of like the edge of a sphere. On our nose, we know that there is a sphere at the end, right? And then we can break down our nose into different planes that are kind of cube-like, right? And so when we think about our face, we can start to think about how we can take this knowledge of our basic forms and apply it into how we're shading our face. All right, so I think our last question that we're going to go over is whether or not we can name some different forms and kind of how they relate to different shapes. All right, so go ahead and take a minute. If you can't come up with any, maybe like Google some and see, you know, what you're familiar with. Pull out your math textbook, and we're just going to go over a few. So over here we talked about our square, right? But it doesn't always have a perfect square. Sometimes it's a rectangle. So down in my space down here, I'm just gonna go ahead and fill in the rest of the space with some other ones. So if we take a rectangle and kind of the same process that we did with our cube, right? We can come in here and make a much longer version of a cube. And what do we call that? Any guesses? It is a cuboid. So our rectangle becomes a cuboid. All right, so I'm gonna just go ahead and do the same values that I did for my cube, except I'm not gonna worry about a shadow. So these guys are just gonna be floating in space, not sitting on anything. All right, what else could we do with a square or a rectangle? What if we stood it up on edge, right? This was our shape. And we spun it in a circle. I know we've seen this shape before, right? We get a can, right? Some of that soup or something in it. So when we take this shape, very similar to our cone, it's going to be darker on one side and it's going to lighten up as we come around. Can do a few directional marks to see that it's a circle. All right, what do we call this? A cylinder. So we could either say that the circle is pulled down or our rectangle is rotated, and we get a, make sure I spell this right, cylinder. Not sure on that spelling. I don't know why I didn't have it written anywhere. We all know I'm a bad speller. So we've got our rectangle to a cuboid, our rectangle or sphere, sorry, circle to a cylinder. What about our pyramids, right? Are these the only kind of shapes that we can get with our pyramid if we do a triangle? Right, we've all seen this, right? We've got an edge over here, right, that gets colored in one, and then one over here as well, right, if I'm looking down at it. If I'm looking at the side, it might look something more like this, right? And then that's an edge over there that we don't get to see, right? So we have our pyramid. And if we have a tetrahedron, right, that means it has a triangle base, right? So it's got three sides. So 3 equals our tetrahedron. Right, we could have 4 sides, which would give us our square. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. Right, and so 4, we're just going to call it a square pyramid. And then we can do the same thing. If we use a hexagon or a pentagram or an octagon, any of those things are just going to become that many more sides to add to our triangle. The main thing that we're looking for in a pyramid is you've got your flat shape on the bottom, and they're all coming up to one point, right? So our pyramid comes to one point, even with our circle, right? Shape on the bottom comes up to a point. All right, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at one more that I don't think we're familiar with. We don't know has a name, right? What do we do if we take a circle and we send it on a journey like this? What shape do we get? What does this remind us of? Maybe if we're hungry, we'll think of it. Anybody think donut? Ooh, we love donuts, right? Put some sprinkles on it. All right, so that shape is actually called a torus, right? And same thing here. What we've got going on is if we do our outside circle, we can come in and find those points. And get those going. And then we're going to find our bottom of our donut and shade up until we hit our light source. And then on the inside, right, the light's not hitting over there, we can come up until we find our light source over there. All right, so that is how we figure out the difference between shape and form. So we're right around 25 minutes in. Should take you maybe a half hour if you were pausing and kind of going along with us. Make sure that in your notes you've got all of this information written down. If you wanted to write more notes or organize it a slightly different way because you feel confident in those skills, that's fine with me. I just want all of this information organized on your page. If we're new to note taking, you could literally copy line for line what I have here. We should have been doing it as we followed along, as per the directions in this tutorial. But once you have finished this, go ahead and take a photo of it and you will upload it to Schoology for credit. So this is kind of your evidence of following along with the tutorial. All right, good luck if you're going to rewatch and follow along, or good luck submitting it to Schoology. All right, bye everyone.